Did you know that tariffs are as American as apple pie? I know that's a funny thing to say, especially given that Mr. Trump is imposing tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada, our three largest trading partners. But let me say it again, tariffs are in fact as American as apple pie. And the reason I say that is that in the history of our country, tariffs have been the norm, not the exception. So let's go back to the beginning. When the 13 colonies, this is before they became states, were still part of the British Empire, they pretty much imposed tariffs on everything and on anyone. They even imposed tariffs on British goods, even though at a lower rate. Later, when the 13 colonies became 13 states, loosely operating under the Articles of Confederation, that's between 1783 to 1789, guess what they did? They imposed tariffs on each other. So you had this ridiculous situation that, for example, a product going across the river from New York to New Jersey would be sold at a higher rate because of tariffs than New Jersey imposed on New York. And the same thing would happen if a product went from New Jersey to, let's say, Delaware, Pennsylvania. You get my point. So that tariff, by the way, was essentially a tax on the citizens of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, etc., etc. Obviously, this was a ridiculous system. It couldn't last. So tariffs between the newly independent American states was one of the reasons why our founders got together in 1787 in Philadelphia to come up with a new system. And that new system is what we live with. It's called the U.S. Constitution. Well, the U.S. Constitution went in effect in 1789. I think it was on March 4, 1789. And we had our first Congress, the first U.S. Congress. And guess what? What was the major thing they did? Their first major act was the Tariff Act of 1789. So our first Congress started imposing tariffs on foreign goods from other countries. Now, this is no accident because tariffs was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of State. And he wanted tariffs for two important reasons. One, to generate revenue and help pay down the debt that the colonies had incurred during the American Revolution. That's called assumption of debt. So that was a big deal. Generate revenue, pay down debt. Second reason was to protect America's nascent manufacturing base, its industry, from foreign competition. America's industry was a nothing. Everything really came from Europe, particularly Great Britain, and a lot of stuff actually came from China as well. But that's a more complicated story. So, two reasons: generate revenue, protect our industry. Does that kind of sound like what Mr. Trump is proposing are the reasons for these tariffs? But there are major differences. Hold off on that. So, when we talk about tariffs, how much tariffs are we talking about? At times, tariffs would go up to 60%. And even in the 1930s, America's tariffs remain amongst some of the highest. In the 1930s, they were as high as 50%. So how much revenue are we talking about from tariffs? Well, the revenue from tariffs was substantial for our federal government. And that made sense when our federal government was so small. At times, we even had less than 1,000 federal employees. And many of them, incidentally, were actually employees who worked in customs. And we had a service called the Revenue Marine, something to this effect, Revenue Marine Cutters. Essentially, they were the predecessors to our Coast Guard. And the main job was to intercept ships and impose tariffs, get the money from tariffs from them. Well, tariffs was such a big part of our government's revenue that they actually helped, partial partially helped President Andrew Jackson pay down our debt. In 1835, America had zero debt. And let's not get excited, that only lasted for a few months. But that really happened, and part of it came from tariffs. And going forward, speaking of Coast Guard, and going forward, in 1915, tariffs remained 30% of our government's revenue. Now, 1915 is an important year, the teens, because we begin to enter World War I, but also in 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified. And that gave the US government the power to impose income taxes. But income taxes didn't become a major part of the federal government's revenue for a while. It took decades. Well, starting around World War II, let's say 1942 when we entered World War II, up to about 2016, America began to rely less and less on tariffs. This is kind of a low tariff era. Now I said 2016. Guys, what happened in 2016? We had the 2016 presidential election between Ms. Clinton and Mr. Trump. So since 2016, tariffs are back in the picture. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Mr. Trump is imposing tariffs for two reasons. One, to protect our industries, and to raise revenue. There are three major differences between Mr. Trump's tariffs and the tariffs in our history, going back to the 18th century, Alexander Hamilton, and going forward to a major part of the 19th century. First is that Mr. Trump tariffs are also being imposed for reasons that are not related to trade, namely the drug war, i.e. fentanyl, and also immigration. The second thing is that Mr. Trump's tariffs are a form of punishment. In the 18th century, or for most of the 19th century until like the 1860s, till America became an industrial behemoth, America could hardly punish anyone with its tariffs because America's economy was so small. And the third thing, as far as protecting our industries, again, America's industries were very small. We're really a nothing. We stole technology from Britain to start our own industries. That's a whole different podcast. So, Mr. Trump has said something that I think is very important in his on his account in Truth Social. He said something to the effect that he essentially conceded that, look, yes, tariffs may have some short-term pain. They may inflict some pain on consumers because prices may go up. But in the long term, they'll have benefits for us, right? Guess who else said that? Alexander Hamilton. He said pretty much the same thing. Tariffs may increase prices in the short term, but in the long term, they will benefit us. But the situation between now and Alexander Hamilton's time is just like different worlds. As historians say, the past is a foreign country. So for more on tariffs, go check out my program on historybehindnews.com, where you'll find my interviews with 155 scholars and counting from universities from all over the world. These scholars I've interviewed talk about many subjects, from Chile to China, from Turkey to Finland, and from royal weddings to our patents and to our environment and to our politics. Take care, guys.